Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Ikuta. I am presenting on this topic, a major regional center service, which is Respite, and also presenting with Maria Ariate, who will be covering the second half of this presentation. So, just I'll give a little background about myself, a little background about DRC. If everyone could please reserve their questions toward the end of the presentation, only because a lot of times when questions come up, it ends up pretty much getting answered as we go through the topics and the information. And as we go through that, then we will have a question and answer session, time permitting, after we go through all the slides. So, getting started, I am an attorney. We are both attorneys from Disability Rights California. I'm from the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Practice Group, which means a lot of the work that I and my group do is access to regional center services, including respite. If we could go on to the next slide. And then just a disclaimer, the following presentation, it is for education only, does not constitute legal advice or counsel. Your situation is unique, and if you want our assistance, please call our DRC intake line. It is included in the chat. And it includes the hour, I believe it includes the hours as well. And the information in these slides, law changes, policies develop, and other things happen where the information could become outdated. We do our best to try to keep these up to date as much as possible, but just be mindful of that. So, we'll just go right into it. We'll start with, okay, well, what is respite? What are respite services? What's the point of respite? So, the purpose of respite, why it is helpful, is that it gives families a break from having to provide that constant caregiving for a person with a developmental disability. So, that includes giving the parent of a child with a disability a break, some time for them to do something that they want, some relief. It could be to any other caregiver who is providing caregiving for another family member under their care who has a disability. And that break, that purpose, that respite, you can use it for any purpose as long as it's to give yourself that relief. It could be you take a break inside the house, like a nap, or for example, or you can go outside the home, go visit friends. It's up to you. And then before I go further, we feel like it's important to include citations to the actual laws and codes from the California statutes. In this case, the Lanterman Act and the California Code of Regs, those are the laws that actually describe the the requirements for how respite services are to be provided for clients of the regional center. Oh, also heads up, I will sometimes refer to those getting services from the regional center as either a client of the regional center or a consumer of the regional center. If I go back and forth, just remember it's the same thing. A consumer is a person getting services, eligible for services from the regional center. It's the legal term that they refer to them as consumers. So just want to touch on that and clear up any potential confusion. So, going on, the types of respite are the main one is in-home respite. And as the name indicates, takes place in the home. So, what does that look like? Well, a respite worker comes to your home. They are present to supervise your child or other family member with a disability. That supervision is generally non-medical type of care and supervision. And as they're doing that, while they're there to supervise and monitor your child, that family member, you can go and take a break, get some respite. Another type of respite is out of home respite services. This is respite that actually takes place in a licensed residential facility. It is also the kind of care that is generally non-medical. Uh, that said, the facility still has to make preparations, be prepared to meet your family member, your child's planned or emergency needs. And out-of-home respite is comes up as a option for, for example, a family where they want to go and take a vacation. They want to actually leave for a certain period of time, but they need some place to be able to watch, supervise that family member with a disability while they're taking that vacation for get some respite. So going kind of into further about in-home respite, and we do think it's important to go into like, okay, this is what counts as respite services and how it actually is being provided and works for you and your child or other family member. So in-home respite, that is, as I had described before, intermittent and regularly scheduled temporary non-medical care and supervision. So it's temporary. Someone comes in, they provide that supervision and care, they give you a break, and then those hours end, you come back. Uh, and it's for a regional center client, consumer, who resides with a family member. So these services are designed to do all the following: assist that family member in maintaining the client at home. So it's basically not only to give you some that rest, that break, but it also helps to have it where in doing so, you're still able to keep them in the family home. You're able to manage their care by also looking after yourself. It helps to provide appropriate care and supervision to ensure your child, your family member's safety when you're gone in the absence of that family member caring for them, typically. And it relieves that family member, you, from the constant demanding responsibility of caring for your child or other family member. And so, having described what respite is and where it takes place and what types of respite, you may be wondering, okay, well, how do I get it? How does one become eligible and how do I get it authorized, paid for by the regional center? So, eligibility for respite services includes the following. Consumer, your child or family member, lives with you, the person who's caring for them. Uh, the individual program plan, IPP, the team who makes up and creates that IPP service plan, agrees that there is a need for respite, that you need respite, that you and your family member, child, would benefit from respite. Not only does the team agree, it's written in the IPP, the actual, outcome and goals, that as an objective, the need for respite and who's providing it. The consumer, your child or family member, requires more care and supervision than a person of the same age who does not have a developmental disability. This last part just generally refers to the reality that as a child or as someone caring for a family member or a child with a developmental disability, you're doing a lot more, doing a lot more in managing their caregiving compared to a individual of the same age who does not have a disability that your child or other family member does. And this comes up. This comes up sometimes though, like in the kind of early start context. It is possible to get respite in early start, but because very young children, ages 0 to 3, generally require a lot of care and supervision based on the fact that they're that young, regardless of even if they don't have a disability, that factors a lot in whether or not you actually can get respite if you're in the early start program. So just wanted to emphasize that last part. Who is a quote family member? Because the law actually says family member. So the family member is someone who lives with a person with a developmental disability. So usually a parent caring for their child. You, the parent, you're the family member. Your child is the person with a developmental disability who needs the caregiving, living in your home. You're responsible for providing, you as the family member are responsible for providing 24-hour care and supervision for the person with a developmental disability. And a family member does not include a resident care facility. it also does not include a foster family home that is getting funds from the regional center or any other public agency. That said, that doesn't mean that someone who is going through the plans to become, like, if they're doing foster parenting and going through the process of formally adopting or or taking over the care or adopting or guardianship of a of an individual who has a disability won't be able to get that. They could still get that respite care, but if you are a foster family home and you're getting funds from the some other public agency or the regional center, you don't count as a family member, and you can't really, for that purpose, you can't really get respite.
I'm sorry, I'm having sticky fingers here. So
I was like, wait, did we
for
skip
me,
one? Is that that's the next one, right?
yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so going over into how one qualifies and can get respite from the regional center, the next question is, how much respite can I get? How much of a break can I get from the 24/7 caregiving I provide for my child or other family member? And again, want to emphasize, like, respite can also, if you're like a sibling caring for another, uh, if you're someone caring for a sibling who's an adult who has a disability, you also qualify for respite. It's just that typically the situation is family, parents caring for a child. How much respite can I get? So there actually used to be a specific bar to the number of hours the regional center can authorize. I say used to. That limit, specific number was repealed and getting on to 7 years ago in January 2018. So that limit at the time was 90 hours of per quarter of in-home respite, and I realize I should put that per quarter in there, and 21, and overall a limit of 21 days of out-of-home respite. You could not get any more than that. Like regardless of how uh, great the need or your individual extreme circumstances, you could not get any more than that. But that was old news. That got changed. There are now currently no limits on the number of respite hours that you can request. Instead, the hours that you can get for to give yourself a break from caregiving is based on the needs and preferences of the consumer, your child or other family member, and you. Now, going further though, if you're thinking like, "Yay, no, oh, you mean no more limitations? I can ask for as many hours of respite as I want. I can ask for 300 hours in a month or something." Just want you to be aware that in requesting respite, there you still have to be prepared to show and explain why you need a certain number of hours. And the higher the number of hours, the more you should be prepared to really make the case for why you need those additional hours and what those hours, what the schedule of those hours are for, and how that relates to the level of need that your child or other family member have. And in fact, some regional centers, in trying to, since that bar got repealed in the law, the regional centers themselves have tried to come up with some way to figure out circumstances where where more and more hours of respite should be authorized. But also, okay, does this actually warrant authorizing more respite or not? So some regional centers use what's called respite assessment tools to determine the number of respite hours. And from examples I've seen from different tools used by some regional centers, what they do is they look into certain factors. Um, what those factors are varies by regional center who use these tools, but it could be like, how many other dependents do you have? Like, not just that child or other family member that has a disability. How many other, children or family members that rely on you do you also have, are you also responsible for with their care? Are you yourself having significant or challenges with your own health? Or do you also have commitments of your own, like work or school? Has there been like recent, emergency circumstances where where that have added so much more pressure on you and warrant more hours in order for you to get a much needed break? So, for example, like another family member getting sick that you have to care for. These are the kind of factors that some of the assessment tools try to take into consideration. Try to see if this is if by case basis, what is the proper number of hours to allocate. But again, it varies by regional center. So there has been some this has raised concerns from other, families getting services from the regional center as to how consistent it is, in terms of how regional centers decide how many hours of respite you get. Maybe you can get a certain number of hours from one regional center, but then if you move and you go to a different area and have to go with that regional center in that catchment area, they have a whole their own process and different assessment tool if they have a assessment tool for figuring out the hours that may not be the same. They may not allocate the same. So this has raised concern. So there's been a movement, a development toward creation of a standardized respite tool. Basically, like, hey, instead of each regional center having their own, trying to work out their own tool and factors and tables and graphs for figuring out the number of hours, let's have one tool with all the factors and how it's uses to measure the need for respite used by all the regional centers. Um, and so this has been currently the state agency that monitors the regional centers is trying to figure this out and draft one that is suitable for a as a standardized respite tool. And that state agency is the Department of Developmental Services, DDS. Um, Now, again, not surprisingly, this has got garnered a lot of attention and also concern because it's like, well, what if DDS creates a tool that ends up, making it harder to get a suitable number of respite hours? What are the factors is DDS going to include in their tool that it's going to then make all the regional centers adopt into their own policies? So just giving you in a head, just want to guys let you know that this is being developed right now. There is no standardized tool, not yet anyway. And in fact, DDS is inviting public comment. And about as to from the public about how they should draft and create that tool, including any concerns, critiques as to what they've have drafted thus far. So I actually put in the chat, like if you go at the very beginning of the chat, I included the link to a draft of a standardized respite assessment form that DDS posted on their webpage. And again, it's a draft. They're inviting public comment on it. We actually encourage the public and you guys to to review it yourselves. Like, is there something really amiss? Is there something missing in that tool? You're like, oh no, this really needs to be taken into consideration, especially for a family where if they're having that issue, they really need a lot more respite hours. And there also, so I also included a link to the public comment, how to submit the public comment as to the assessment tool draft. So just want to let you guys know what's going on right now with that whole respite with the that with the process for figuring out the number of respite hours. Uh, but I also want you guys to be aware that in trying to argue for, you know, the proper number of respite, the proper amount of respite, that the law does strongly encourage the following, and you can use this if this is something that's affecting you if you're a parent of a minor child, a child who's under the age of 18 years old. The Lanterman Act, strongly supports, encourages that a child, stay in the family home, that they stay in the home with their parents or other family members in their community. And what this and this this even this language is so strong that it even includes a provision that if a minor child is at risk of being placed outside the family home, like an out-of-home facility, um, the regional center has to step in. They have to look into every possible way to help you, the parents or other family member, in keeping the child at home. And so I put that in there because in situations like this, where there's a very real risk that because of your child's needs or behaviors or other factors or health, that they could be placed outside the home, you can turn to the regional center and argue for a significant increase in services, including respite hours, if that is what it takes to ensure that your child stays in the family home. Because for some families, it's, look, I'm absolutely overwhelmed. I need a break and I cannot manage my child's care, which is also which is lead is contributing to the risk of them being placed outside the family home. So I just really want to emphasize this provision of the law and how you can use it to argue for more respite if you are in this kind of situation. And sorry, Maria, I think this was the last slide I was
That's
going to
it.
cover, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Okay. Um, I touched on it in the previous slides, but remember, you know how regional centers seem, some of them have their own kind of respite assessment tools and ways that they determine it. Yeah, that's because each regional center has their own purchase of service policies, or POS. So some regional centers' POS policies uh, still may have caps on the number of respite hours. Fortunately, this is less of a problem. It was definitely after 2018, as some regional centers had not yet updated their own policies, where they kept saying, "Oh no, you can't get any more than 90 hours per quarter." When we were like, "Wait, the law changed, regional center, you got to go back and change these policies ASAP because you're giving the wrong information to families." So that strict like statutory bar that they had written into their policies has is pretty much gone at this point. That said, some regional centers will include certain language um, that will indicate that there is a kind of a certain amount of hours that a limit, a typical higher number that they authorize, and that you should expect to face some be prepared to push if you want more than that number of hours. So, but that being said, regional centers have to look at each at each consumer's need for respite on a case by case basis. They can't say, well, we normally do no more than 40 at most. It's like, no, they got to look into your individual circumstances and consider all the information that you share as to why you and your child need more respite. But I just want you guys to be aware of this. So I have seen examples of purchase of service policies where regional centers will say, "Oh, we this the typical number of respite is this number per month. The customary number is this number per month." This is not this again. Just be aware, this is not a bar. This is not some strict ceiling limit on the number of hours. You can ask for more. So if you see that, don't let that dissuade you if you genuinely are in a situation where you need that many more hours in order to get a much needed break.
Thank you, Emily. I just wanted to add, purchase of service policies are the regional centers on their website have the purchase of service policies. More and more, I'm finding them under a tab called transparency. Um, Depends on the regional center. It could be buried. The purchase of service policies could be buried somewhere else. But if you can't find the purchase of service policies, you could always ask the service coordinator to show you where they are. And as far as my own experience, all the purchase of service policies that I've seen, not from every regional center, but they all have respite, a way to figure out the respite hours for a person. Respite can also be available if the consumer has some nursing needs or behavioral needs. Obviously, the person who's going to provide the respite has to be trained. to provide the services. And so, for example, if the consumer is going to need a nurse to be present while you have some respite, the regional center will do a nursing assessment to figure out what kind of respite worker is needed. What are the nursing skills that are needed to cover for when you are not available? Same for behavioral. If the consumer has behavioral needs, there should be an assessment to figure that out and have the appropriate behavioral respite worker. So respite can provide incidental medical services. So that includes, and this is straight from, the Welfare and Institutions Code. It includes ileostomy, colostomy, catheters, gastrostomy. And again, there's a lot of information here about training. The, the respite worker is going to need to get the training in order to provide the service. Emily talked about out of home respite, and she mentioned a very typical example, which is the family wants to go on vacation. I've also heard of the following. Consumer has very high needs, medical needs, and other needs. And so mom is the respite worker Monday through Friday. And then on the weekends, he goes to an approved residential service provider for out of home respite. That gives mom Saturday, Sunday time to rest because his needs are so many needs. So even if you're receiving in-home respite, if for some reason you also need out-of-home respite, that's a conversation to have with the service coordinator. Just like anything, services can terminate. So these that you see here are reasons for terminating services. Let's say that you don't want the respite services anymore. If a consumer moves outside the service area, let's say moves from one regional center to the other, well, uh, the new regional center is going to probably most likely do a new assessment for respite, but the services shouldn't just end because the consumer moves from one regional center to the other. Or maybe respite is jeopardizing the consumer's safety and health for some reason. But if that's the case, I would say there should be an IPP meeting to discuss what it is that the consumer needs in the respite provider. What's the health and safety concern and how can that be addressed so that respite can continue? If the service agency that was providing the respite no longer can do it, well, then the regional center has to look for another vendor. And I remember, Emily, remind me, I think this respite is one of those services too where family members or people who are not vendored can also provide the respite. There's a handful of services that allow you to do this, and respite is one of those. And I'm trying to remember the term. It'll come to me.
Yeah,
So
it's oh no, sorry. Uh you it's more like respite is a participant directed service.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
participant directed. So you don't you don't necessarily need to go with someone who's vendored through the regional center. You can find someone, and obviously there's criteria for that someone to be a respite provider, but that opens up options. So you don't have to worry so much about just being able to use respite providers that are vendored through the regional center. Just like every service that the regional center provides, they have to make sure that there isn't a generic resource for that service. In other words, are you receiving any other public program that would provide that service? That would be a generic resource. So let's say, for example, I have Medi-Cal and I go to the regional center and I ask for a wheelchair. And I have Medi-Cal, remember. So the service coordinator, rightly so, is going to say to me, Maria, you have Medi-Cal, and Medi-Cal provides under certain circumstances provides wheelchairs. You need to go to Medi-Cal first before we can even consider. And that's what I would have to do. I would have to get a letter for me to go back to the regional center. I would have to get a letter from Medi-Cal saying they don't cover it, they're denying it. Um, and then the regional center could consider purchasing that wheelchair for me. So if if you're asking the regional center for anything that and another agency could provide you, you're going to have to go to that agency first. They're going to say to you, that's a generic resource. You have generic resources. You have to exhaust them because the regional centers pay of last resort. And on this slide, you have examples of what could be considered generic resources. So if I have Medicare and home supported services, if I'm a client of the region of the Department of Rehabilitation and I'm asking the regional center for money for books or whatever. Well, that's something that the Department of Rehabilitation for books because I'm going to school to be, you know, to learn a profession. Well, that's something that the Department of Rehabilitation should be helping me, and that would be a generic resource. School districts could also be generic resources. I'm sure some of you have had that happen where you go to the regional center and they say, "Oh no, your child is in special ed," and they could get those services through the school district. Uh, Other examples are if you have private health insurance. California Children's Services is considered a generic resource. Now, there's a very special provision in the Lanterman Act that says that there should be no gaps in services. So, what does that mean? So, I go to the service coordinator and I say I need a wheelchair, and she'll say to me, "Well, you've got Medi-Cal, you should go get it from them first." And I say, "But I can't access the community. I can't even move around my house. My power wheelchair is no longer working, and I can't use a manual wheelchair." Well, under that circumstance, the regional center should be providing the wheelchair for me under what's called gap funding. So that's really important. A lot of people don't know this. So when you're asking for gap funding, of course, the regional center is going to expect you to try to get that service from your generic resource. But in the meantime, because of your need, they can they can provide or pay for it. Really important. IHSS. So this is common. I don't know how common it is, but it's been common in the past where someone goes to the service coordinator and asks for respite. And then the service coordinator says, "What? You have IHSS. That's a generic resource and we can't provide respite because it's a generic resource." Well, IHSS is not a generic resource. IHSS, there is a provider who provides services, who might provide domestic services, related services, including meal prep, meal cleanup, laundry, may provide personal care services, protective supervision. This provider is doing work. Respite is to give someone a rest from the work. Two very different services. So so IHSS is not a generic resource for respite because they provide different services. So don't get, you know, if you have a service coordinator telling you that, um, that is not correct. Um, and if that happens, you can always call us for maybe some further help. Um, okay, so we've had these kinds of calls with clients. We're talking to the parent and we say, "Well, how much respite do you want?" "I want 100 hours a month." Uh, okay, why do you want 100 hours a month of respite? "Because I do." Well, you know what the chances are of that person getting 100 hours a month in respite? Probably like this. It's not enough to say, "I want." You've got to show why you need the hours that you're asking for. So if you want 100 hours a month of respite, you're going to have to show why. And Emily touched on those factors. What are the care needs of the consumer? Maybe the consumer also has behavioral needs that the provider or the parent addresses, or a lot of medical needs, that there's just a lot of care involved. Are there other kids in the family? If so, are there any kids with disabilities? What's the parent's responsibility for taking care of those kids? The parent may have his or her own health, mental health, or physical health concerns. All of those things factor into the need for respite. I remember I had a client who had twins, consumers of the regional center, and she did kind of like this, what I described. She went to the service coordinator and asked for a bunch of hours for respite, but didn't say anything else. And of course, they denied. I got involved. I spoke with the parent, and then I learned a lot from speaking to the parent. I learned that her husband had left the country, he had cancer, and while we were sorting out the respite issue, he died. So she's left with twins in elementary school. She works full time. She was having to leave work early to pick them up from school, take them home, help them with their homework, feed them, bathe them, put them to sleep. After she put them to sleep, she would continue working. She was getting flack from her employer. They weren't happy that she was leaving early, despite the fact that she was staying up late at night working and doing her work. She was obviously, with everything that was happening with her husband leaving and then passing away, she was having her own psychological issues, and she was to the breaking point. Um, and she never talked about this with the service coordinator. And in a conversation I had with the program manager and the service coordinator and mom, this program manager said, Maria, if we had known all of this, we the you know we would have worked with mom, but she never told us any of this. And there was more information that was divulged. It and the information that the parent gave certainly made a great case for her to get many more hours of respite. I think part of it too was the culture issue. She's from a culture where they don't talk about, you know, these things. So it was hard for her to talk about this, but you need to talk about these things. Now, it could be that, we don't have a standardized assessment tool. If your regional center has an assessment tool, you're going to have to work with it. But all of the purchase of service policies have exceptions. And so if you're not getting enough through the assessment tool that the regional center is using, just say, look, I should get an exception for this tool, and this is why. And you need to talk about the situation in your home and why you're asking for these hours, right? If you find that you're not getting enough respite hours, things change, you can always call an IPP meeting, and the Lanterman Act says that the regional center has to hold an IPP meeting within 30 days of you asking for it. If they go past 30 days, they're violating your rights, and you have the right to file a 4731 complaint. If they deny or reduce your respite hours, get a notice of action, and there's an appeal process, which includes an informal meeting. It can include mediation before you get to a hearing. And the stats on resolution prior to hearing, just generally speaking, I'm not talking about just respite, are pretty good. A lot of matters get resolved at the informal meeting stage. So, you know, for those of you who are a little scared about going to a hearing, it might resolve even before a hearing. Um, if you don't get a notice of action and your respite has been reduced or taken away, just call the Office of Administrative Hearings. That's the office where the judges are housed. That's the entity that hears these kinds of hearings, and just say an appeal. And you don't even have to call. You can go on the DDS website. There's an appeal form. You can fill it out and just say you never got a notice and you want aid paid pending. So, because sometimes regional centers will not send notices of action when they should. These are some resources for you, our website, and we have a manual called the Rights Under the Lanterman Act, or we call it the RULA, and there's information also about respite in Chapter 6. Our intake line is here, and it tells you when we're open to take calls, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday from 9 to 3. Okay, so we have come to the end of the presentation. We're going to go ahead and stop recording.